And welcome as we continue our journey into where wisdom can be found. We are entering now into the fourth chapter of Proverbs, which has a few verses that you may recognize once again out of context. And we'll try to focus in and see what the words mean in their context and how this ongoing curriculum for the process of transmitting wisdom is shared now that we turn to chapter 4 in these next 27 verses. So we'll go around the room together and I'll read the Hebrew and I'll ask each of you to please join in with 5 lines in the English. Chapter 4, Mishlei. Shimu vanim musar'a v'hakshivu lada'at bina. Shirley, if you can start, please.
Hear, O children, a father's reproof, and listen so as to know discernment.
Ki lekach tov natati lachem, torati al ta'azovu.
For good learning have I given you, forsake not my teaching.
Ki ven hayiti la'avi, rach v'yachid lifnei imi.
For I was a son unto my father, a tender only child for my mother.
V'yoreini v'yomer li, yitmach devarai libecha shmor mitzvotai v'chyeh.
And he taught me and said unto me, let your heart hold on to my words, keep my commandments and live.
Kne chochma, kne vina, al tishkach v'al tet me'imrei fi.
Get wisdom, get discernment, forget not, neither swerve from my oral teaching.
Okay. Marian, al ta'azveha v'tishmereka, ahaveha v'titzrecha.
Forsake her not, and she will guard you. Love her, and she will keep you.
Reshit chochma, kne chochma, b'chol kinyanecha kne vina.
The beginning of wisdom is, get wisdom, and with all that you get, cultivate discernment.
Tzelal tzeleha uteromameka, techabdecha ki techabkena.
Extol her, and she will exalt you. She will honor you when you embrace her.
Titen l'roshecha livyatchen ateret tiferet temagenecha.
She will lay upon your head a garland of grace, a crown of splendor will she bestow upon you.
Shma b'ni v'kacha marai v'yirbu lecha shnot chayim.
Hear, O my son, and take my sayings, that the years of your life shall be many.
Okay, Arthur. B'derech chochma haritecha hadrichatecha b'ma'agle yosher.
In the way of wisdom I have taught you. I have led you on the paths of uprightness.
Belechtecha lo yetzar tza'adecha ve'im tarutz lo tikashel.
When you walk, your steps shall not be straightened. If you run, you shall not stumble.
Achazek b'musar al teref nitz'ereha ki hi chayecha.
Hold fast to instruction. Don't let it go. Keep it, for it is your life.
Be'orech resha'im al tavo ve'al ta'asher b'derech ra'im.
Enter not into the path of the wicked, and do not walk not in the way of evil.
Pera'ehu al ta'aver bo shte me'ala va'avor.
Avoid it, don't pass it on. Turn away from it and pass it on.
Okay, Shirley, back to 16. Ki lo yishnu im lo yera'u ve'nigzela shnatam im lo yachshilu.
For they do not sleep except they have done no evil, and they are robbed of sleep if they cause some to fall.
Ki lachamo lechem resha ve'yein chamasim yishtu.
For they break wicked bread and drink violent wine.
Ve'orach tzadikim ke'or noga holech va'or ad nechon hayom.
But the path of the righteous is light's radiance, ever brighter till the perfect day.
Derech resha'im ka'afela lo yadu b'ma yikashelu.
The way of the wicked is as darkness. They know not on what they stumble.
בני לדברי הקשיבה לאמרי התאזנך.
My son, listen to my words. Incline your ear unto my sayings.
Okay, Elyssa, do you have the text? We're in chapter 4, verse 21. You want to join us?
Sure.
Okay, so I'll read the Hebrew, read the English, please. Al yalizu me'enecha shomerem betoch levavecha.
Let them not depart from your eyes, guard them within your heart.
Ki chayim hem lemotzaehem ulechol besaro marpeh.
For they are life unto those that find them, and healing to all their flesh.
Mikol mishmar netzor libecha ki mimenu totzaat chaim.
More than anything, guard your heart, for from it are the ways out of life.
Haser mimecha akshut peh ulezut tzvatayim harchik mimecha.
Put away twisted speech from your mouth, and keep far from you perverse lips.
Okay, Marion, do you want to do the last three for us? Einecha lenochach yabitu va'apapecha yashiru negedecha.
Let your eyes look in front and gaze straight ahead.
Pales ma'agel raglecha v'chol drachecha yikonu.
Level the pathway of your feet, and all your ways will be sound.
Al tet yamin usmol haser raglecha mera.
Do not veer to the right nor to the left. Keep your foot from evil.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, everybody. So these are 27 verses, which again seem somewhat repetitive. They sound somewhat familiar. There seems to be recurring imagery that we see here, but there is also some things that are new. And also, once again, verses that have been taken out of context, that have been ritualized in a way that we saw last week. Once again, this week, there has been a ritual moment that is embedded in here that we need to talk about as well. So what are some of the things that you notice, questions or observations before we go into a few of those verses? Miriam?
Well, there seems to be something from the Shema.
Oh, Lisa,
Similar.
Okay. Where do you notice the Shema?
Well, it's not exactly the same, but verse 21.
Okay, so let's see here. How is it the same? Al yalizu me'enecha shomrem betoch levavecha. Okay, so what's the similarity? You're talking about the Shema in Deuteronomy 4 and 6. What specifically is the same? And what's different?
To put these words like to teach them to your children and put them in your heart and near your heart and your eyes and your head. Okay,
and so here what's being said is you have einecha and levavecha. So you have the eyes and you have the heart. And the goal is to make sure in the second paragraph of the Shema, it says, Lo taturu acharei levavchem acharei enechem asher atem zonim achareihem. Don't go whoring after your eyes, nor after your heart. And don't wander after your eyes and your heart and to go whoring after them. So there it's referring to probably to idolatry and the idea that the eyes and the heart are intertwined. So here the language, the verbs are different, but the focus is the same. That if the eyes are focused, then the heart will follow.
I was actually thinking as well about tefillin.
Okay, do you see any other references to phylacteries that could be in here?
Just in terms of the placement.
Right, so the heart, the hand, really it's the head and the arms, which is supposed to be directly connected to the heart. So that's
right, but if the phylacteries rest on the third eye.
Mm-hmm. Right, okay. And then also verse 9, there was a suggestion last time too with this similar image. She will lay upon your head a garland of grace, a crown of splendor she will bestow upon you. It wasn't clear what she's putting on your head. Last time we said the reference could have been an amulet, and the amulet could be referring to tefillin, but it seems less likely that it was that, and it could have been something else, but it's all very possible.
Even in 20 and 21, like they start they have the similar ideas and to the way the Shema works. Like the 20 is about listening to.
Right, but what do you notice? This is an interesting point. This is different than Deuteronomy because it says, it doesn't say Shema. What does it say?
Oh,
The verb that's used here is hakshiva,
Hakshiva.
right? So it's different. Shema is translated as, Shema Yisrael is translated as,
Listen, Israel.
hear, O Israel.
Oh, here. Okay.
Hear. So listening and hearing are different both in the Hebrew and the English. What's the difference between listening and hearing in the English?
I guess hearing means you get the meaning of it. You're not just doing it on a superficial level. Listening could be, well, you know, there's music in the background and you know it's there.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're hearing it, you're getting the message.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a big part of what's going on here. Like when we say the Israelites were na'aseh v'nishma, shma, nishma, that we will do and we will hearken, we will do and we will understand is another part of the way that it's explained in Exodus during the moment of revelation. So to ask someone to listen to your words here is the call of the teacher to the student, the father, in this case to the son, to listen to my moral advice, to cling to the teachings of wisdom, and to concentrate. And the first goal in concentrating is, as Arthur said, there's a lot of other noise that could be distracting you. Listen to what I'm saying, right? This is a listen up moment. And it's a way of, specifically, he's asking the son to actually, I want you to turn, incline your ears towards me so you can actually listen to what I'm saying. Okay, listen to me as opposed to hearing and understanding. So there is a difference, and that's important to notice. What else do you see in the patterns that, and the images and the forms of instruction that come out in this curriculum here? Is there anything different that we're seeing this time?
Well, it bothers me. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend last week, and these kind of things were in last week's also. And I don't know how you dealt with them, but where it seems to say, if you follow my commandments, you're going to live. You're going to, further down it says in 22, it says, follow my commandments and will heal your flesh. And in the garland of grace, and the other one said your silos will be full. So how do we deal with this since we know it's not true?
Well, this is a big issue in the wisdom text because they're looking at the moral calculus that Elyssa brought up in the book of Deuteronomy, which says, if I am good, then I am rewarded, and if I am evil, I'm punished. Okay, so that's a common theology of reward and punishment, or of just deserts, that we see in the book of Deuteronomy. The wisdom texts are supposed to address that and to say, we look at the world and we realize that there is a tzaddik veralo, there's a righteous person who suffers, rasha v'tovlo, there's an evil person who prospers. Why is that? So one of the things, first of all, to notice here is that moral calculus is not exactly the same. It's not talking about commandments here that come from God. This is a father talking to a child, a teacher talking to a student, and saying specifically in those, like in 22, which we're going to look at in a moment together in more depth, it says, Ki chayim hem, for they are life. They are life-giving. What are they? It refers to my words, okay? So there's something about an oral tradition of wisdom. It's not about commandments anymore. This is about the wisdom of experience. I'm going to teach you how to navigate life, the teacher's saying to the student. And if you listen to what I'm saying, then you will find that these words are life-giving and they may bring healing to you. Now, what specifically that means, we're going to look at in a moment, because it's a very strange verse that seems to be more symbolic than suggesting that if you say abracadabra, somehow you're going to be healed. But it's speaking about words of wisdom, and it's not speaking about commandments here. That's the first shift away from the just deserts theology of of Deuteronomy. But we're going to come back to this again, and there is this sense that somehow moral advice from the wisdom of experience will teach you how to navigate the dangerous paths that's based on experience, not on commandments. So that's the first approach to it. Though we'll have to take a look further and see what the wisdom is here that's different than in the book of Deuteronomy. Marion, you wanted to say something?
I thought there was something new along the lines of what Elyssa was saying, but in verses 20 and 21, because there's a shift. So it says, incline your ear, mm-hmm. and then in 21, it's actually visually seeing the word. So first it's hearing, and then it's seeing. So you can't state that you can't see words unless they're written. So there's a connection, but he's connecting the oral and the written.
Right, which is an ongoing concern. And again, the things that give encouragement are words of advice, which are primarily oral, but they're supposed to direct the way that you see the world. That's part of the concern here. We're going to take a look at that in 22 in a moment. There's a very interesting way that this has been read that I want to share with you. But these are good points that you're bringing up. And again, in 25, it says as well, right? It doesn't say, look towards my commandments. It just says in 25, let your eyes look in front of you and gaze straight ahead. Don't be distracted by I'm telling you this like a horse. You're a horse and you need blinders. Okay, if you want to move the carriage forward, what does a horse need? Blinders. Otherwise, what happens to the horse?
He gets distracted.
Exactly. And that's part of what the teacher's saying to the student. In life, sometimes you need blinders. Now, does that mean it's going to guarantee that you don't encounter evil? No. But what he's suggesting here is that the wise person, to the degree that it's possible, chooses not to veer into the pathways of evil, and really that it's a moral choice that we make rather than addressing the issue of suffering. Suffering is addressed in the book of Job, but we'll see there's a in terms of why the righteous suffer, the whole book is dedicated. 40 chapters are dedicated to that question. So we can't expect Proverbs to give us a reasonable response to it when it's already been known that there is a full-length exposition on that in the book of Job, which we could look at a different time. But here, it's not addressing suffering. It's addressing whether we make a moral choice to do good or to do evil, to veer to the right or veer to the left. Shirley?
I was thinking after we met last week, and something that Marion had said about the physical part of the physical action of the walking and walking on the path. And it made me think that when somebody goes astray, they say they're off the derech, that they've gone off the derech. And so it really speaks to a lot of what is here about being on the right path, as opposed to, and there's a physical action, there's the mental decision, but it's also like the whole body experience.
Right, that's very important. And you'll notice that, for example, in 26, it talks about the derech. Derech comes up quite a lot. And there's different words that are used for the path or the way. But here it says, V'chol drachecha yikonu. In verse 26, all your ways are all should be sound, and to make sure that you level the pathway of your feet. So there's a way of translating what one feels in the heart and how that guides the ability to be able to see which way to go, and then the body responds. And this is all can be within a microsecond. But what the wisdom text is trying to teach us is they're all part of a system that works together. And if you don't have a foundation from which the system that it has a moral compass to follow, then you will be distracted and you will find yourself wandering into evil ways. So it's about creating a moral compass rather than a system of commandments. Okay. Now, who recognizes verse 2? I want to go back to that for a moment, and then I want to look at 22 that Arthur brought up. Sound familiar? Ki lekach tov natati lachem torati al tazovu. Translation is a struggle, but it's something like, for a good portion or for good learning have I given you, forsake not my teaching. Torati al tazovu. And then we go into the passage we read last week, which was Eitz Chaim hi lamachazikim ba. Okay, so last time we looked in chapter 3, Eitz Chaim hi lamachazikim ba v'tamchei me'ushar. She is a tree of life for all that hold fast to her, and all those who hold to her ways are steadfast. So remember, we spoke at length last time about where that has been recontextualized and how it's used in Jewish ritual as an anchor for family and community, as a compass. Where is Eitz Chaim hi lamachazikim ba used?
In the Torah service.
Right, so the ritual of returning the Torah to the Ark. The opening verses that precede Eitz Chaim hi, which is the final closing verse before the doors of the Aron, of the Ark, are closed, before we get to Eitz Chaim and saying the Torah is a tree of life, it is that source of wisdom. Before that, we say, Ki lekach tov natati lachem. So right before the Ark is closed, we say, for good learning have I given you, forsake not my teaching. So it's interesting to see how this conversation here in chapter 4, which is really between a master and a disciple, between very much a father and a son. And we talked last time about the difference between a father chastising the son as opposed to the mother who is teaching the child, and that there were certain expectations and probably more chastisement that the son received than the daughter, but it's not entirely clear. But there were gendered spaces for cultural learning, and this is being used symbolically to talk about different genres of teaching. What is more about the, as Bev put it once, it's the ethical guardrail that you learn from the paternal side of the law, and then the nourishment that comes from the Torah of the mother, right? It says earlier on when we were looking in the first chapters, not to abandon listen to the reproof, the musar avicha, of your father, the paternal reproof, and also take to heart Torati mecha, the Torah of your mother. And so, of course, then to make the maternal become embodied in the tree of life, which is a symbol for the woman of wisdom, which we looked at last time together, all come together in a ritual where the Torah is dressed elegantly, like in royal garb, much like a queen, and then she is put back into the ark and put away until the next time we encounter woman wisdom in the garden through the tree of life. So that's a ritual that comes from, it's taken from chapter 3 and chapter 4 in these verses, but introducing the process of the recessional, of returning the Torah to the ark. It says Torati al tazovu. Now, why would it say here, and why would the sages want to replicate, in a sense, this chastisement or this warning that the father is giving to the child and that the master is giving to the disciple? Don't forsake my teaching, because now through the rest of this chapter, the context of forsaking the teaching is to do what? How would the teacher know that you've forsaken the teaching? It would be evident both from your heart, because the teacher knows your heart, through your eyes, as well as through your feet and your hands, right? All those markers, if the teacher really knows the student, would be evident. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. But there's an anxiety of abandoning the teaching and falling away from wisdom and walking the path of the wicked. Okay, so now it's interesting. That's what it means in this context. But when the liturgists put this into our liturgy and use it as a recessional piece, we have to ask ourselves, what is it that the anxiety is that's being evoked here when you close the ark? You're about to close the ark. Once the ark is closed and the Torah, which is the tree of life and woman of wisdom, is put back into the ark and shut, what's the fear and the anxiety? That we are going to forsake the Torah. Through what ways are we going to forsake it once the ark is closed? I mean, we're still in the middle of prayer. So how are you going to forsake this in a moment of prayer? What do you think the anxiety is here?
Well, I mean,
you'll forget about it?
Praying. If you are just repeating the words meaninglessly, that would, to me, mean forsaking. If you're praying with, as they say, kavana, then that means you're really, you're not losing the Torah, you're keeping it in your heart.
Okay, so praying with kavanah is definitely a concern the sages have. Elyssa also mentioned that you'll forget it, but more than just forgetting it, the question is, even if you were to remember it, if it's just
Idolatry?
idolatry is another possibility. But if you're doing it through rote behavioralism, which is for the sages can be almost like a form of idolatry, then you forget it. It's not implanted inside of you. And so the sages teach very early on, all the commandments require intentionality. They require kavanah in order to be able to be implanted. And we know this in terms of most learning as well for students that learn, that the teaching is not absorbed if, first of all, if active learning is not taking place, but more specifically, if the meaning is not made and transmitted, right? If it's not a process of active meaning making, the teaching won't stick. And so that's definitely a concern. And this Torah-ti then also asks the question, if you were to look at that, my Torah that is being given unto you, whose teaching and whose Torah is this? In the context of chapter 4, whose teaching or whose Torah is this? It says mine. So whose is it?
Wisdom?
In chapter 4. Well, in chapter 4, it's either woman wisdom or it is, who else could it be?
King Solomon.
That's true. Who else?
Could it be something like a King Solomon or Kohelet?
Well, we don't have a king here, but we do have a teacher. So it could be the master. So it could be the master, the teacher to the disciple saying, don't forsake my teaching that I'm giving to you. Or it could be through, by extension, don't forsake woman wisdom, right? Don't forsake the teaching of woman wisdom. In either case, it is mine to transmit unto you. Now, what's interesting, I wanted to just share with you one interesting way of reading. Remembering, of course, this text is being ritualized, the Torah is being put away. And so it's very much now in Jewish life, in a post-biblical world, it refers specifically to the Torah. Okay, so what happens when you forsake the Torah? If you don't have kavanah when we pray, then the words don't inform our moral compass. And in the same way, by extension, Torah is always linked to tefillah, and tefillah is connected to Torah. So we pray, and part of the words of liturgy are oftentimes original words, but they're also called from words of Torah that become liturgized, as we're seeing. And so after we finish praying, there is a common choreography that, even though the Torah is put away, every day to do a little bit of studying. And after one studies, so you pray, you study, and then you go to work. And that allows the moral compass to be realigned every day. That's the reason why there must be a little bit of study, even if it's just for a few minutes every day, to realign the compass. Otherwise, you forsake it. So the master of the good name, known as the Baal Shem Tov, who was responsible for the renewal project of Judaism through Eastern Europe in the mid-1700s, the Baal Shem Tov looked at this verse and was very concerned about it. And he was speaking about it not just in the context of putting the Torah away in the ritual of prayer, but he was concerned about people putting Torah away from their spiritual lives. So as Arthur said about kavanah and prayer, you need to have a kavanah when you pray and also when you study. If you don't, then there's no way that the teaching becomes implanted within you. And he makes a very interesting observation. Remember, when we're moving into the 18th century, this is the time of the Enlightenment, where Jews are encountering the Enlightenment. They're encountering different ways of reading the world through a critical lens, specifically through philosophy and critical perspective. And there were many Jews who were becoming enlightened, so to speak. And as you become enlightened, you also begin to critically re-examine everything that you've taken for granted, including your religion and the Torah. And many Jews of the Enlightenment period were becoming assimilated into modern culture. They were becoming, or at least vying for the attention of the political sphere in which they lived, and they wanted to become equal citizens. So they wanted to be like everyone else. And so one of the ways of equalizing that was to take a critical approach to religion and to use the rational mind to explain everything. That's the context in which the Baal Shem Tov is trying to bring Jews back to a meaningful connection to the Torah and not to abandon it, because in the modern period, this was a very real dilemma. Do I continue to carry forward the tradition of Torah and Tefillah of my ancestors, or if I'm becoming assimilated in part of modern culture and I'm becoming an enlightened person, then what value is there of this teaching? So it was a very real and burning issue. The Baal Shem Tov looks at this verse and he looks at the Jews around him who are quickly assimilating and disappearing from Jewish life. And he says, Torati, the Torah that I have given you, from this, he's referring to, and the verse, the Baal Shem Tov says this is referring to the revealed Torah, the Torat HaNigleh, the exoteric version of Torah. When you look at it and you open a book or you open even the scroll, you might think, Natati lachem, that God is saying, I've given it to you, basically, which means that it's yours. So once I've given you something, right, if I give you a gift, and let's say I give you a car at your 16th birthday or 18th birthday, I give you a car as a parent, I give it to you, and then eventually what's the tendency of the child to do once they've had the car for a little while? What do they think?
That it was always theirs all along. They forget.
That's
not
exactly.
only gave it to them, but
that's right.
The gift to begin with.
Right. So I think that it's my car because I've been driving it all this time, but I forget someone gave it to me. And he's saying that the Jews are beginning to forget when they look at the revealed Torah, because you can put it into a book, or even because you have a Torah scroll in a community. You think if I gave it to you, then you actually forgot who gave it to you, that it was a gift, right? And he goes on to criticize many of the modern rabbinic authorities of the time who, and with this influence of the Enlightenment, he says, we're searching for leniencies and they're opposing challenges to the Torah because they think that it was given to them and they somehow own the Torah. You don't own the Torah. He says, if you really want to learn Torati, if you want to learn my teaching, my Torah, that is God's Torah, then he says you also need to learn through the Pnimiyuta Torah. There is a deeper inner teaching of the Torah that's not just found in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, that red book that you put into the pews, or the Torah scroll that you can buy for X amount of dollars. You don't own it just because you bought it. You can order 800 copies of a book, or you can have 60 Sifrei Torah, but it doesn't mean that you own the Torah. And that's what he's saying in suggesting that when we think that these ritual items are something that we own and that we can tally, we buy insurance for it, you lock it up in a cupboard and you own it, he says you're mistaken, because then you've forsaken the reality of the transmission, which was that it was given to us as a gift, that there is a deeper reality that is experienced in entering into a relationship with Torah. As soon as we think it's an object that we own, even if we think that we've mastered it with our rational minds, which many of the Jews of the Enlightenment period thought, the Baal Shem Tov is saying, you've forsaken what Torah is really about. Torah is not about something, a project that can be mastered with the rational mind, and there is no one who owns it, because ultimately it is still God's Torah. Whatever that means, it's still sort of shrouded in mystery, but he's suggesting an interesting rebuttal to the Jews of the Enlightenment who are drifting away from Judaism and from the sense that God is connected to the Torah at all. Remember, the Enlightenment period with scholars like Julius Wellhausen and others in that period would say from a critical perspective that the Torah itself is a text that was composed of literary documents written over different periods of history by different human beings in different communities. So it removes, once you do that and you say that it's a completely human, immaculate document, what does that remove from it?
Divine inspiration.
That's right. I mean, you could say the human beings who did it were divinely inspired, but Wellhausen and the other critical scholars are basically saying it's a human document. It's like reading Shakespeare. It just happens to be a really good piece of literature. But do you live your life according to Shakespeare? I mean, if you're Harold Bloom of blessed memory, who was a friend and teacher of mine, yes, he was someone who did. But aside from Harold Bloom, I don't know too many other people, maybe my brother, who's memorized most of Shakespeare, but most people don't live their life according to Shakespeare. So the same thing applies to the Torah. If you look at the Torah only as a literary document, which has value because we can learn a lot by reading it as a great work of literature. But if that's all that it is, then you've forsaken the purpose of it, which is supposed to align our inner compass. It's supposed to be a guidebook for the pathways of life. And that's something that the Baal Shem Tov was concerned that ultimately, by posing all of these questions of the rational mind, and specifically looking for leniencies in terms of how to integrate this into our lives, he's saying that the project of Jewish enlightenment is going to ultimately forsake my Torah, which is the esoteric Torah that he wants to keep alive and burning in the hearth and in the hearts of the Jewish people. That's something that's really important for him, and that becomes the calling card of Hasidism. This project of Hasidism is about chesed. The root of chesed is compassion. Where is the seed of compassion? Where does that seed of compassion come from in our lives as human beings? From the heart. From the heart. Okay, and so he's trying to say that if you only look at the Torah intellectually from the place of the rational mind, it's not enough for it to be able to have an impact. It doesn't suggest, he's not suggesting that you have to abdicate the rational mind, but the Enlightenment project of Judaism that has led us to certain crossroads in Jewish life even today is one that is bereft of any heart, of feeling, of what in Yiddish is called hergesh. If you can't feel it, then it's not going to last. And that's part of what the teacher is saying to the student in the original context of chapter 4 in that verse. So it's interesting to see how it becomes recontextualized as part of a Torah recessional. And then later on, many centuries later, it's used as a calling card for Hasidism to say, I want to invite you into a relationship with Torah that is not only head-centered, but also engages your heart. And if it engages your heart, we've just learned from chapter 4, that means that it affects your eyes, the way that you see the world and the way you process it, and also the way you walk in the world. And therefore, it can be an invitation to living a more integrated life. So I think it's a very interesting way of rereading that verse based on the two contexts that we've seen together. It's an interesting way of rereading it in the modern period. Marian?
Is it too much then to say, Rabbi, I like the comparison with Harold Bloom? I remember he always used to say that, you know, literature is really not that important to anyone except the person who reads it. It just makes me more interesting to myself. Whereas,
well, I don't know if that's fair, to be, with all due respect. I mean, Harold, you know, if you look at the invention of the human and the way that he looked at Shakespeare, it's not just about making myself feel better. He was arguing further on, Marian, that something as grand as Shakespeare exposes us not just to feel good, but to understand what does it mean to be human. That's what a great work of literature does, is it doesn't just make us feel good, but it also expands our horizons to understand what does it really mean to be human.
Yes, but sorry, I don't mean to get off track with Harold Bloom as much as I would have loved to have met him. But when I think of Harold Bloom, I think very much that he has architecture in his mind of having read literature, and the literature itself creates this architecture that we carry with us in our mind.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he meant by saying it only makes it more interesting to me. But in relation to what you're talking about here, and perhaps I'm sure Harold Bloom was aware of this too, that wisdom, according to what you just described, is not something that we can internalize with an architecture in our mind. It's something active to be engaged with.
Yes, but I would also just remind us that it's not limited to an architecture of the mind. But remember, the argument of the book and the way that it's set up is that it does have a certain architecture. There are pillars to the house of wisdom that we are meant to dwell within and then to walk out from into life. So it's all about how we walk into life with absorbing that that template. So I would say it builds on part of what you're saying.
But that's actually something that always confuses me, especially about the symbolism, because I always think that perhaps these are more like fence posts rather than real architecture. Architecture is always going to be something solid, something set, that is so once we know something, that architecture is always defined and set, and without us being able to control it, it is inevitably limited, because we have those, so that if you don't want that limitation in thinking and in experience, then these symbols are very important, but more as fence posts on the path rather.
Right. I think that the curriculum in Proverbs would suggest that even though there may be a grander architecture in the cosmos that brings wisdom down into the world, the human way of integrating them is through signposts. So I agree with you. It's definitely about signposts, and it's about walking in the world. So for the other piece that I wanted to look at, since we're looking at a Hasidic rereading of Proverbs, and that would be an interesting project in and of itself, is to see how the 18th century Hasidic movement turned to specific proof texts in scripture to make their case. And I just so happened that when I was looking through the rest of the commentaries that I peruse in preparing this class, in 422, this verse that Arthur brought up that was somewhat disturbing, for they are life, that is, those words are life unto those that find them, and healing to all their flesh. So listen to this interpretation, which actually comes from Boisbriand, from the Tosha Rabbi. I was very intrigued to see, and this I think opens up to us, what does it mean for wisdom to be transmitted? How do we transmit wisdom? I don't think I ever would have imagined that I would have used this verse to explain the transmission process of wisdom, but bear with me for a moment and I'll share with you a piece that I just translated from the Avodat HaAvodah, which is one of the places where the Tosha Rebbe's teachings have been recorded. So it was recorded in Hebrew, originally probably given in Yiddish and then transcribed into Hebrew, which was very common in the Hasidic world, because the oral transmission process, which I'll talk about in a moment, primarily is done in Yiddish and Mamalashan, and then after Shabbos, it would be recorded by disciples who memorized the entire discourse, and were automatically able to translate from Yiddish to Hebrew, which, if you think about it, is remarkable skill. First of all, to remember everything the Rebbe said in your mind in Yiddish, and then after Shabbos to be able to turn the switch and flip all that you've remembered and memorized in Yiddish into Hebrew. So I'm translating it from the Hebrew. So this verse that we're looking at, for those words, oral words spoken by the master to the disciple, are life-giving to those that find them and healing to all their flesh. So the Tosha Rebbe says, it is known that the holy Baal Shem Tov, who we just looked at before, once said that when a person learns Torah directly from the mouth of their master, only then can the spoken words fructify and multiply within their inner being, namely from these speech utterances that one has heard directly from the mouth of the master. That's what allows there to be an augmentation of my spiritual knowledge and apperception as a disciple, to even be able to understand matters that were not necessarily heard at the moment that they were spoken. Because what happens is that these speech utterances, when they're given orally from the master, enter into the interiority of the disciple, into a state of what he calls implanting, of netiyah. And that implanting of the words becomes fruitful and multiplies. And this entire power is only received when the words are spoken orally from the mouth of the master to the ear of the disciple. Because, he says, it is the hevel, the breath of the master, that activates this energy of transmission, rather than the way one could receive this teaching as a transmission through an intermediary medium that comes between them. So let's stop for a second here. What could be a transmission through an intermediary medium that comes between the master and the disciple, both in the time of Mishle, of Proverbs and antiquity, as well as in 21st century Boisbriand? What could be an intermediary medium that he's speaking about that interposes?
The book.
Yeah, the
Right.
Greek.
So one could be a book. So reading this from a book is not the same thing as being at the foot of the master, so to speak. What else could it be? So you don't want a book, but what else could it be today that he's referring to?
The internet.
That's right. If you get the recording on the internet, right? You have an MP3 or a Zoom class. He says it's still not the same as being there, which we know is actually really quite true. There is something that you cannot capture, even on this great technology, that is not the same as the energy that's experienced when you are actually in the space. So that's one level of transmission of wisdom orally that is given from the master to the disciple. And now listen to what he says in terms of a community. How does community transmission work? He goes on to say, and so it is that when Hasidim, when the disciples gather together to sing songs and hymns to God, behold, he says, it's the energy of the melody, which again implants, notea, it implants the sacred energy within the person who is there, and it functions to elevate and to reveal what he calls the inner point that is concealed within one's heart. And then once again, this energy fructifies and multiplies within. And he goes on to say the same thing. But if one hears songs and hymns such as those that were experienced at a tish or at a gathering, but it's transmitted through a medium, even if you listen to the recording, now we're talking about recordings, you listen to the recording and you get the melody as it is unfolding and you can hear the rhythm, you may be aroused at that moment and touched by the music. Nonetheless, what he's saying is, however, the sacred energy is not being implanted, and therefore it doesn't grow inside of you like a seed. And he says this is the same when it comes to the studying of Torah. Okay, so he's talked about first, it's the master to the disciple, transmission of wisdom. Then he talks about songs that are sung in a communal setting, and how that also leads to a sacred energy that implants it inside of the person that is there hearing it. And then he goes on now to address the specific verse of ours in question. When it comes to studying Torah, a person needs to fulfill the commandment of Talmud Torah by way of being in the presence of the mouth of the speaker, precisely. You cannot hear it through a medium, as our sages have taught us in the Talmud, for they are life unto those that find them and healing to all of their flesh. And he says, don't read unto those, the words unto those that find them, rather, not motzi'im, he says, motzi'ehem, that is rather unto those that speak it through the mouth, right? That it's only life-giving if you hear the teaching orally. And then, as that happens, that the teaching is spoken through the mouth to the ear, it extends to the one who is present listening as a healing to all of their spiritual needs. And he closes with a very interesting anecdote, and says that it's really important to be able to, when you teach, articulate the teaching with a full voice to ensure that every word is really heard by the students and the disciples that are there. He goes on to explain that's the reason why grace after meals and any blessings that we recite after eating should be said with the full voice and not whispered, but should be articulated out loud, because there's an impression that is created by the orality and the resonance of the words themselves. And then he brings up a story and says, remember the case of a student who would learn his lesson silently, and it would repeat the lesson silence in silence. After 3 years, according to this Talmudic story, the student forgot everything that they were taught. All the more so then if you repeat the teaching out loud that you receive, if you hear it out loud and you repeat it out loud, then that what has been implanted inside of you in the moment where the teaching is being transmitted will live on, because it's been implanted inside of you. And now the language of implanting probably sounds strange. If Alan was here as a gardener, I'm sure he would have something to say about it. We'll remember to ask him next time. But remember that the blessing of an aliyah to the Torah specifically says when we are reading the Torah, the end of one of the blessings says, V'chaye olam nata b'tochenu. What does that mean? Because we are grateful to opening Torah and bringing it into our lives because Chaye Olam Nata B'tochenu, the ultimate purpose of life has been implanted within us. So Torah here is seen to be something that you implant within a person. And once it's implanted, the question is how effective is the seed going to be? If you put it out into your garden, you know how challenging it is to ensure that the seedling grows into a vegetable or a full fruit, right? You have to tend to it like a real gardener. But the process of implanting, the Tosha Rebbe is saying, is most important. It doesn't matter how much sun and how much fertilizer you give to the seed. If it's not implanted with the right kavanah, and more specifically that the transmission itself is oral. If it's only written in a book, or if it's only heard in a recording, then that process of the deep implanting doesn't take place, and eventually the teaching is forgotten, which takes us back to the anxiety at the beginning, which was al ta'azovu, don't forsake my teaching. And the way that we forsake the teaching is either because it's forgotten, or because we decide to move on a different path. And both of those anxieties affect not only the wisdom teacher of Proverbs in the curriculum, not only the rabbis who create the liturgy with the Torah, but also many generations of Hasidim who are concerned that the teaching will be forgotten. Arthur.
Well, I certainly know, I believe that myself and the vast majority of people belonging to the conservative movement have not found any master whose feet they should sit in front of in order to learn things. We basically do it on an intellectual level. If I wanted to, to suddenly learn Torah from a master, where am I going to go? Who's the master? How is this?
I think that in the non-Orthodox world, one of the great challenges that we have, and especially you're referring to the conservative movement, the conservative movement is based on what we talked about earlier in terms of the Enlightenment project, which was it was based on an idea that through the rational mind and through the critical scientific inquiry of the mind, we could understand all of Judaism. And there is a positive and a negative, or there's a blessing and a curse to that. The blessing is that we are now able to uncover things about Torah we've never been able to uncover. The curse, or the downside, is that there is no master, as you say, and there's no transmission process in most cases or in most communities where that takes place. And that's a function of the way the movement was founded, and it's also a function of the way that our institutions are structured. So there are a lot of pieces that contribute to either enabling or disabling that from happening. By contrast, if you were to go to Tosh in Boisbriand or to any Chabad shtibel, or you went to 770, I think, Arthur, you mentioned to me once you went to 770, so you know what that experience was like. It's a hierarchical system that is set up where it's clear that the Rebbe is the one who is the master of the Beit Midrash, that is of the house of learning, the master of the synagogue, and the master of the institution. And so everything aligns with that vision and ultimately with that teaching. If you look, for example, there's a new book that just came out called The Social Vision of the Rebbe by Philip Wexler. It's a fascinating sociological investigation into what it is about the structures that supported Chabad in America to allow them to become the remarkable institution of Torah and Tefillah that they've become, based on and inspired by part of the Baal Shem Tov's teachings here, as well as what's in Mishlei. If you look at Wexler's book, you'll see that there were some very specific strategies that were used on an institutional basis to enable that rather than to disable it. And I think the challenge we have in the non-Orthodox world is that we're children of the Enlightenment. And as a result, more or less, whether it's the conservative movement, the reform movement, the reconstructionist movement, whatever, we have all, to a certain degree, embraced that structure of reading Torah and teaching Torah and even davening and praying and limiting it to the rational mind. And the more that we continue to do that, the less of an opportunity we have for those experiences to be implanted within us in a meaningful way. And so I think that's a huge, huge perennial challenge that the movement faces locally and globally. And it's not just the conservative movement, it's all forms of heterodoxical Judaism that no longer value the experience of direct transmission. And that's for a lot of different reasons. I've just touched a little bit on it. If you read Wexler's book, you'll see how it is that it has worked so effectively. And that's something that I think really needs to be taken to heart. So Elyssa and then Marion, welcome to Morton and Bev. We're just finishing up. I'm sorry that we missed you.
I'll let Marion go first.
Okay, Marion?
My question, Rabbi, is that I don't want to reduce everything too much, but can you say then that there's a creative power in listening that actually transcends any other kind of understanding? That there's that it's because there's a spark of creativity in actually hearing, that is a unifying mode of learning across all our other senses. So we can see.
Yes, I do think that's what's being set up here, right? Is that, again, it's really interesting to read the Bible backwards. That is to say, look at the wisdom text and notice that this is actually the guidebook you're supposed to use rather than beginning the story of Judaism. If you want to read about how to become a Jew, and Elyssa and I dedicate a lot of time to working with learners on all levels, but especially students who want to convert to Judaism. And the question we always ask is, so where does the story begin? Do you open up the Bible and start reading the book of Genesis? Well, you could, and that'll begin to tell you the story of our people and what it means to become a Jew. But to think like a Jew and to have a Yiddish cup, Shirley, right? A Yiddish cup is, you have to actually start backwards. You need to start from the wisdom texts to understand what's the project of Judaism, so that when you get to the book of Genesis, you know how to read this story and what it actually means for your life. Otherwise, they're just interesting sacred stories. They may or may not inspire you to live a meaningful Jewish life, but the wisdom texts are here to tell you, listen to the text attentively, make sure that your heart is open and available to receive the teaching. And then in the process of allowing the heart to be open, it affects the way the mind will begin to listen and then ultimately to hear and to process intellectually, which will then be translated into the movement of my feet as well as the workings of my hands, so that it becomes a fully integrated wisdom path. And that's something that is incredibly important. And that's why it sounds repetitive, but the curriculum here is very clear that it won't happen effectively, and there will be no continuity to this wisdom curriculum and this project called Judaism if we cannot begin as students by listening. Listening is the first task. And if you think about how much time you or people that you know in an age of accelerated information and constant chatter, how much time do we actually spend really listening deeply? Think about it in the course of a week. With all the distractions and all the accelerated information you receive, how much time do you actually even have to listen? And then to go to the next step, which is not just to listen, but then to process the listening into a hearing, which is an understanding that affects the way that you live your life. And you'll begin to slowly see, or quickly see, I think, that we have very little time that is allotted in our life to actually be able to listen deeply. So Elyssa, and then we're gonna conclude.
I just wanted to going back to this, I'm very entranced by this idea of wisdom, about real wisdom being transmitted only orally, and what you were talking about with the breath. And it reminds me of the passage in Genesis about God breathing in the soul into the human being, and that's what makes the human being alive. And so I see that there's a connection there, but at the same time, like, the skeptical part of my mind is saying, well, this is a very convenient way for these people to maintain the power structure.
Of course.
You know, if they say it's only going to be effective if you listen to the master's words, then it really is like a buttress for their
Of course it is. It's
hierarchy.
just, yeah, you can be a cynic, and you're totally justified in being cynical and critiquing the system and saying all this is doing is just buttressing their own power and authority and allowing the institutions at Boisbriand or at 770 to continue on in a hierarchical fashion where there's always one master at the top of the pyramid and everyone else is some version of a disciple. That's true. There's no doubt about it. That's the real issue that we have to deal with, is to address what Arthur said, which is what are the implications of different institutional structures that either enable oral transmission or disable it. There's no doubt that it's about vying for power and authority. The rabbis throughout the ages have constantly done that. The Hebrew calendar, for example, was a huge controversy within the early Jewish communities, and that was about vying for power and authority between the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes. We're always trying to create institutional forms that require power and authority. Unless you're in a radically egalitarian community, let's say like 1777 Tiberius, which never lasted beyond a very short period of time, which was about co-leadership, and it was anti-hierarchical, and it was very much horizontal. We don't have that many examples of successful models of community, except, let's say, the Chavurah movement in the 1970s in North America, the Jewish catalog, the sort of this version of the independent minyan, which has flourished as like the next generation of that as an iteration. But what that assumes, though, is that everybody who comes to an independent minyan or a chavurah, every person who comes has mastered something on their own, and they're coming as masters to be part of a circle where they can take care of everything, and they share in the transmission with the group, which is a different model than saying there's one master and then there are disciples. It's different between a vertical model and a horizontal model. This model is in the last in the Boisbriand generation is very vertical. In the Baal Shem Tov's generation, it tends to be a little bit more horizontal, because the Baal Shem Tov is coming and sharing these teachings with, not with disciples, but with colleagues who are on the same level as he is.
Okay, but let me just conclude my thoughts, please, by saying that I'm not sure I agree that the conservative movement has a paucity of these masters. And the one thing that I think is evident from the studying that we're doing right now even is that there is definitely something special and important about learning orally and engaging in dialogue, because it allows us to, as opposed to the written word, to veer off the path and use different metaphors and different people's contributions to deepen our own understanding. And we call that dialogical learning. Mm-hmm. And with respect to there being no masters in the conservative movement, I would disagree. I've met some, and I certainly think that this class and the contribution that Rabbi is making is evident that there's a master in the house.
It's very kind, but it's true. What Elyssa does allude to is that within our movement, there are some master teachers that are there, whether they're in institutional frameworks or whether they're part of communities. And I guess the challenge, if you look at the challenge here, is that when the Tosha Rabbi says you can't get it from an intermediary medium, that means it's not through another book and it's not through another recording, but it's actually by being in the community. Aside from Zoom and what this pandemic has brought us, we really have been these very localized communities where, unless you're traveling, like you have, your grandchild is in Chicago, so you go to a conservative synagogue in Chicago, or you're in Toronto, or you're in Vermont, you'll do a little bit of traveling here and there, but there has not been enough of a dissemination of these master teachers and their teachings, which hopefully in the coming century, in the coming years, we will go from good to great. I think we've been good at it, but we can do a lot better. And that's something that that I think is incredibly needed, because we live in an age where we're bereft of meaning. As Rollo May once said, there is a cry for meaning, and it comes from the fact that we are just very disconnected from these sources, and that Baal Shem Tov's anxiety was Torati al tazovu. That's really the function of relying only on one part of who we are. And if we're not integral, that is, if we only rely on our minds, then there is no hergesh, there's no heart that's left to the process, there's no kavanah, and then we proceed at our own peril. And these teachings, which have been transmitted from generation to generation, we are in peril of losing them. And so hopefully you've been inspired to share something you learned with someone that you love, or someone that you're bubbling with. And then once it becomes safe to leave the bubble, you'll share it with somebody else. But that's the purpose of these teachings, right? Is that ultimately that the student becomes the teacher, and that you become empowered to share one thing that touched you with someone else. And then eventually they share it with someone else. And that way, there is no sense that the tradition has been abandoned or forsaken. So let that be our, yes, Bev.
Sorry, I misread the time, so we missed, but are we able to hear the recording from this moment?
Yes, I'm working on getting all those pieces up onto the website. Mm-hmm. Next time we're going to be meeting is again at this new time of 10 o'clock, a little earlier, and we'll be going on probably to chapter 5 together.